Welcome back to Reddit Whispers. I've read a lot of stories here. Stories of betrayal, revenge, and the shocking moments when you see someone you love for who they truly are. I always thought those were things that happened to other people, dramatic tales spun for online karma. I never imagined I'd have one of my own, one that feels so cinematic and yet so painfully real that I still have to remind myself it happened. My story is about love, or what I thought was love. It's about trust, technology, and a trap so perfectly laid that the person who walked into it never even saw the bars until they were locked inside. It started, as these things often do, with a quiet shift, a subtle change in the atmosphere of my own home, a place I had built with my own hands and filled with what I believed was a shared future. My wife, Isabella, was the kind of woman who seemed to have been sculpted from sunlight and bossa nova. When she walked into a room, she didn't just enter, she arrived. Heads turned, conversations paused. She had this laugh that could disarm armies and a smile that promised you were the only person in the world. For 8 years, I believed I was. We met in Rio, a whirlwind romance that felt like it was ripped from the pages of a novel. I was a software engineer, a quiet, methodical man who found beauty in clean code and logical systems. She was an artist, a free spirit who found beauty in chaos and spontaneity. We were opposites, and everyone, including us, thought that was our strength. I provided the stability she craved, and she provided the vibrant color my black and white world needed. Our life in a beautiful, modern home in Sao Paulo was, by all accounts, perfect. I was successful, my cybersecurity firm was thriving, and I gave her everything she could ever want. Or so I thought. The first crack appeared not as a chasm, but as a hairline fracture, almost invisible to the naked eye. It was her relationship with her phone. It had always been an extension of her hand, but now it became a fortress. It was angled away from me, snapped shut when I entered a room, and the password, once a shared anniversary date, was suddenly changed. When I asked, she'd laugh it off, a tinkling sound that now sounded less like music and more like shattering glass. She'd say it was a surprise she was planning, or a silly spat with one of her friends she didn't want to bother me with. I, the fool who loved her, chose to believe her. I was a man who dealt in data, in absolutes, in finding vulnerabilities in complex systems. It was my job to be paranoid, to assume the worst, to trust nothing and verify everything. Yet, in my own home, I suspended all my professional instincts. Love, it turns out, is the most effective malware for the human heart. But the data points started to accumulate, impossible to ignore. There were credit card charges for lunches in restaurants I knew she disliked, for flowers sent to an address that wasn't ours. There was the scent of a cologne on her clothes that wasn't mine, a scent I later identified as a trendy, expensive brand popular with a younger, flashier crowd. And there was Tiago. His name started as a whisper in her phone calls, a friend of a friend, then a colleague on a new art project. Soon, his name was a ghost that haunted our home, present in her silences and her distracted smiles. My professional mind, the part of me I had suppressed for so long, finally kicked in. I didn't need to confront her. I needed irrefutable proof. It was a cold, detached decision, the kind I made when launching a penetration test on a client's network. I was no longer a husband. I was an auditor of my own life. I used my skills not for vengeance, but for truth. I set up a network sniffer on our home Wi-Fi, a passive tool that simply analyzed the data packets flowing in and out. I wasn't hacking her phone. I was merely observing the digital ecosystem of our shared space. The truth came in a flood of data logs. Late-night texts filled with a passion she hadn't shown me in years. Location data placing her at a boutique hotel across town on afternoons she was supposedly at her yoga class. It was all there in sterile black and white text. The affair with Tiago was real. The pain was physical. It felt like a core process in my own operating system had been corrupted, causing a system-wide failure. For a week, I walked around in a fog of grief. Every shared memory felt tainted. Every "I love you" she had ever said felt like a lie. I watched her across the dinner table, smiling, talking about her day, and all I could see was a stranger. A very beautiful, very convincing stranger. The initial impulse was rage. I wanted to scream, to break things, to confront her and her lover and expose them to the world. But my logical mind, the very core of who I am, held me back. A messy confrontation would give her power. It would allow her to play the victim, to twist the narrative. She would cry, she would apologize, she would make it about my anger, not her betrayal. No, I needed something else. I needed a solution that was as elegant and ruthless as a perfectly written piece of code. And then, as I was reviewing the network logs one night, I saw something that changed everything. Amidst the social media traffic and messenger apps, I saw repeated connection attempts from her phone to IP addresses associated with known spyware and keylogger software. She wasn't just cheating, she was plotting. She was trying to breach my digital life. And her target, I quickly surmised, was my finances. This was no longer just about infidelity. This was about a calculated, premeditated attack. She saw me not as a husband, but as a bank to be robbed. The grief I felt curdled into something colder, harder. It was the moment the man who loved Isabella died, and the cybersecurity expert took his place. A plan began to form, a complex architecture of deception. If she wanted to see what was in my bank, I would show her. I would build her a window into a vault of her own making. For the next 2 weeks, I became a ghost in my own life. I told Isabella I was working on a massive, high-stress project for a new client, a story that explained my long nights and distracted demeanor. She bought it completely, even feigning sympathy, which only fueled the cold fire in my gut. My real project was far more personal. I began by creating a complete clone of my primary banking application. To a casual observer, it would be indistinguishable from the real thing. It had the same logo, the same user interface, the same login screen. I spent days perfecting every pixel, every font, every transition animation. It was a masterpiece of digital mimicry. But beneath the surface, it was a completely different beast. It was a standalone application, a sandboxed environment that connected not to my bank servers, but to a private server I controlled, hosted on a secure cloud platform. This was my digital stage. Next, I needed to populate the stage with a believable performance. I couldn't just invent a number. It had to look real. So I wrote a series of scripts that would scrape real-time financial data and transaction styles from public APIs, anonymizing and randomizing them to create a convincing history of deposits, withdrawals, and stock trades. I built a fictional portfolio of volatile tech stocks and cryptocurrencies, making the balance fluctuate in a realistic way. The final touch was the balance itself. It had to be a number that was both impressive enough to tempt her and plausible enough for her to believe. I settled on a figure that hovered around $500,000, a life-changing amount of money. The bank account was the honeypot. It was a gilded cage, and all I had to do was leave the door open. The final step was deploying the trap. I couldn't just install it on my phone. She had to believe she was looking at the real thing. One evening, feigning frustration with my work project, I complained loudly about my banking app being buggy after a recent update. I uninstalled the real app in front of her, making a show of it, then reinstalled it from what looked like the official app store. Of course, what I actually installed was my creation. I logged in, showed her the impressive-looking balance with a sigh of relief, and then casually left the phone on the coffee table while I went to take a shower. I knew she would have her spyware installed within the hour. I could almost feel her eyes on the phone, the gears turning in her head. The bait was in the water. From that point on, my life became a performance. I was an actor playing the part of the oblivious, hard-working husband. I watched as her spyware, which I had allowed through a specific loophole in my home network's firewall just for her device, began to siphon keystrokes. I saw her capture the login credentials for my fake bank. I saw her log in again and again in the dead of night, staring at a number on a screen that I had invented for her. The data I collected was damning. I saw her search history, how to transfer large sums of money without detection, international non-extradition countries, best luxury resorts in the Maldives. She was planning not just a theft, but an escape. She was planning to erase me from her life, taking what she believed was my hard-earned money with her. There was a part of me, a small dying ember of the man I used to be, that hoped she would stop, that she would see the number, feel the temptation, and pull back from the edge. But she never did. With every passing day, her resolve hardened. She became more affectionate towards me, a clawing, false sweetness that was almost harder to bear than her previous indifference. It was the kindness of a butcher sharpening his knife while stroking the lamb. She was saying goodbye, and she thought I was too stupid to notice. The trap was set. The mechanisms were all in place. Every line of code was perfect. Now all I had to do was wait for the snap. The waiting was the hardest part. A period of surreal domesticity where I lived with the woman who was actively planning my ruin. I felt like I was in a nature documentary, a scientist in a blind, observing a predator stalk its prey. Except the prey was a phantom and the predator was my wife. The days leading up to the theft were a masterclass in deception on both our parts. I maintained my facade of the stressed but dedicated husband, absorbed in my work, while she perfected her role as the supportive, slightly neglected wife. We would have dinner, and she would ask about my project, her eyes gleaming with a greedy curiosity she mistook for concern. She wanted to know if the project was going to result in a big payday, a bonus. I would sigh and say something non-committal like, "It's a huge deal. If it lands, we're set for life." I could see the flicker of triumph in her expression, the confirmation she needed that the pot of gold she was about to steal was as big as she imagined. I was feeding her the script for her own downfall, and she was devouring every word. Inside, I was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. There was a cold, calculating core that was running the operation, monitoring the logs, checking the service status of my fake app. But wrapped around it was a raw, exposed nerve of betrayal. Every smile she gave me was a twist of the knife. Every touch felt like the caress of an assassin. I would lie in bed next to her at night, feeling the warmth of her body, and I would have to physically restrain myself from shaking with a silent, consuming rage. I mourned the woman I thought I had married. I replayed our life together in my mind, searching for the point where it all went wrong, for the moment she decided that our vows were worthless and my trust was something to be exploited. Was it always there, this capacity for such profound betrayal, hidden behind her dazzling smile? Or was it a slow corrosion, a decay of love and respect over time? I realized, with a chilling certainty, that it didn't matter. The person lying next to me was not the person I had fallen in love with. Maybe that person never even existed outside of my own hopeful imagination. My surveillance was meticulous. I had a clear view of her digital life. I saw her communications with Tiago. Their plans were escalating. They weren't just talking about a vacation, they were talking about a new life. They were looking at real estate in Portugal, discussing starting a business, an art gallery for her, funded by my stolen money. They were building a future on the ashes of mine. Their arrogance was staggering. They felt untouchable, smarter than the quiet tech nerd she was married to. In their messages, they mocked me. I was o caixa eletrônico, the ATM. I was predictable, boring, too lost in my world of computers to ever notice what was happening right under my nose. Reading those messages was like drinking poison, but I forced myself to absorb every word. It was fuel. It solidified my resolve. Any lingering doubts I had about the morality of my plan vanished. This wasn't just about catching a thief, it was about exposing a monster. The day she decided to act was a Tuesday. I remember it with perfect clarity. It was an ordinary day, which made the events that unfolded feel all the more surreal. I went to work, but I wasn't at the office. I had set up a command center in a small, discreet rental office a few miles from our home. I had multiple monitors, a secure connection, and a direct, real-time feed of all the activity on my honeypot server. At 11:42 a.m., it began. The first transfer. A wire for $50,000. On my monitor, I saw the request hit the server. My script, designed for this exact moment, processed it flawlessly. It generated a fake confirmation, a series of plausible-looking transaction IDs, and updated the balance in the app she was looking at. To her, it looked like a successful bank transfer. In reality, the request went into a log file and then simply vanished into the digital ether. No actual money moved. No alarms were triggered at any real financial institution. It was a ghost transaction. I watched, my heart pounding in my chest, a strange mix of exhilaration and dread. She was doing it. She was really doing it. A minute later, another transfer, $75,000. Then another, and another. She was being methodical, breaking it up into chunks to avoid what she probably thought would trigger a fraud alert. It was an amateurish tactic, something she'd read on a blog, but it showed her commitment. She drained the account over the course of an hour, a series of 8 transfers totaling exactly $400,000. With each transaction she made, I saved a complete data packet. Her device's IP address, the MAC address of her phone, the exact timestamp, the account details of the destination mule account she was wiring the funds to, an account I was certain belonged to Thiago or was set up by him. It was a digital breadcrumb trail leading directly to them, a perfect, undeniable chain of evidence. After the final transfer, the fake app showed a remaining balance of just a few $1,000s. I can only imagine the surge of triumph she must have felt. She had done it. She had pulled off the perfect crime. She was rich and she was free. Around 1 p.m., my phone rang. It was her. Her voice was a symphony of feigned panic. "João, meu amor, something terrible has happened." She sounded breathless, on the verge of tears. She told me a wild story about a series of fraud alerts she had received via email, about strange notifications from the bank. She claimed she had tried to log into the account to check and saw the balance was gone. She was playing the part of the terrified, violated wife. It was a truly masterful performance. I, in turn, played my part. I was shocked, then furious. I told her not to touch anything, that I was on my way home, that I would call the bank, the police, everyone. I made my voice tremble with rage and fear. It wasn't hard to do. The rage was real, just not for the reasons she thought. When I got home, the scene was set. She was pale, sitting on the sofa, clutching a glass of water with a trembling hand. She threw herself into my arms, sobbing about how they had taken everything, how she felt so violated. I held her, smelling the faint, triumphant scent of her perfume beneath her performance of despair, and I felt nothing but ice in my veins. The next 24 hours were a blur of manufactured chaos. I made a great show of being on the phone for hours with bank fraud departments and cybercrime units. Of course, I was talking to no one or to a pre-recorded automated message. I paced the house, running my hands through my hair, slamming my fist on the table for effect. Isabella watched me, her eyes wide with what looked like sympathy, but I knew was glee. She was watching the final act of a play she had written, and she was enjoying the performance of the man she had destroyed. She offered comforting words, made me tea, and told me that money was just money, that we had each other. The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost sublime. That night, she announced she needed to get away for a few days to clear her head. She was too shaken, she said, to stay in the house where our security had been so violated. She was going to visit her aunt in the countryside. It was, of course, a lie. I knew her real destination. I knew she had a first-class ticket to the Maldives, booked under a different name, leaving the next morning. I played the concerned husband to the hilt. I told her it was a good idea, that she should take the time she needed. I packed a small bag for her, kissed her goodbye at the door, and told her to be safe. As I watched her car pull away, I didn't feel sadness, I didn't feel loss. I felt the quiet, grim satisfaction of a hunter whose prey had just voluntarily walked into the snare. The house was silent for the first time in weeks. The performance was over, for now. I walked into my office and looked at the evidence I had compiled. The server logs, the network captures, the screenshots of her text messages with Tiago, the flight itineraries I had uncovered. It was all there, a perfect, hermetically sealed case of fraud, theft, and conspiracy. But the masterstroke, the real checkmate, was something she could never have anticipated. It was the answer to the most important question. Where did the money she was about to spend actually come from? Because while she thought she had stolen my savings, the truth was far more poetic and far more devastating for her. The $400,000 she had just wired to her lover's account wasn't mine at all. It was hers. Or rather, it had been. It was the inheritance her grandfather had left her, a sum that I had been managing for her in a trust account for the past 5 years. She had always been careless with money, and her own father, Afonso, a shrewd and ruthless businessman who loved his daughter but didn't trust her judgment, had made me the sole trustee, with strict instructions to manage it wisely and protect it from her own impulsive nature. The money in my real bank accounts was safe, untouched, hidden behind layers of security she could never have breached. The money in the honeypot, the number she saw on the screen, was a fiction, a placeholder. But the money she had just transferred, the money that was now sitting in Tiago's account, was very, very real. I had initiated the transfer myself from her trust a few days prior, moving it to a temporary holding account that I controlled. The wire transfers she initiated from the fake app were essentially just authorization forms for me. Her every action, her every keystroke was her digital signature on a confession, authorizing me to release her own inheritance to her lover. She thought she was robbing me, but she had, in fact, just robbed herself and handed the spoils to her partner in crime. And her father, the man whose trust she had just irrevocably shattered, was about to find out exactly what his darling daughter had done. The trap wasn't just about catching her. It was about making her the agent of her own destruction. The pieces were all in place. All that was left was to let her enjoy her fleeting victory before the world she had built on lies came crashing down around her. I sat back in my chair, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. The storm was coming, but I was in its eye, and I was ready. The 2 weeks but Isabella was gone were perhaps the most productive of my life. While she and Tiago were living out their fantasy, funded by her own legacy, I was systematically dismantling her life with the cold precision of a demolition expert. My home, once a stage for our domestic drama, transformed back into my sanctuary and workspace. The silence was a balm, allowing me to focus on the final phase of my plan. My first move was to reach out to her father, Afonso. This was the conversation I dreaded most. Afonso was an old-school patriarch, a man whose word was iron and whose family name was everything. He had entrusted me not just with his daughter's financial future, but with her well-being. To tell him she had betrayed me was one thing. To tell him she had conspired to steal from me and, in the process, had stolen from the very fund he had set up to protect her was another. I scheduled a meeting at his office, a towering skyscraper that dominated the São Paulo skyline, a monument to his power and influence. I laid out the evidence on his vast mahogany desk. The printed server logs, the screenshots of the messages between Isabella and Tiago, the bank statements from the Mule account showing the inflow of $400,000, and finally, the records from her trust showing the corresponding outflow. I didn't have to editorialize or add emotion. The data spoke for itself, a cold, hard narrative of greed and betrayal.
Afonso was silent for a long time, his face a mask of stone. He examined each document with the meticulous eye of a man who has built an empire on reading the fine print.
I watched the color drain from his face, replaced by a deep glacial fury. The disappointment in his eyes was profound, but it was quickly eclipsed by a look I recognized, the look of a man who has been crossed and is about to bring the full weight of his resources to bear. He didn't rail or shout. His voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously quiet. He asked me what I wanted. I told him I wanted justice. I wasn't interested in a messy public divorce battle. I wanted a clean, surgical separation, and I wanted his daughter and her lover to be held accountable for their actions. This was no longer a marital dispute. It was a criminal matter. Fraud, conspiracy, grand theft. Afonso, a man who respected strength and despised weakness and deceit above all else, agreed. He saw the situation with perfect clarity. His daughter had not only betrayed her husband, she had betrayed him and his father's legacy. In his world, there was no forgiveness for such a transgression. He made a single phone call to his personal lawyer, a man known for his ruthless efficiency. Within the hour, a legal team was assembled. The machine of Afonso's influence began to turn, its gears grinding with terrifying purpose. While the lawyers drafted divorce papers and prepared to file a criminal complaint, I focused on the digital trail. I compiled a forensic report that was so detailed, so irrefutable, that it would leave no room for doubt in any courtroom. Every piece of data was cross-referenced, every timestamp verified, every digital fingerprint cataloged. I was building a cage of pure information, and with every file I saved, another bar clanged into place. Meanwhile, a world away, Isabella was living her best life, and she was making it incredibly easy for me. She and Tiago were not discreet. Their social media accounts, which I monitored daily, became a real-time diary of their lavish spending spree. There was Isabella, posing on the bow of a private yacht in the turquoise waters of the Indian Ocean, a glass of champagne in her hand, a new, ridiculously expensive designer watch on her wrist. There was Tiago, grinning, driving a rented Ferrari along a coastal road. There were photos of extravagant meals at Michelin-starred restaurants, receipts for $1,000 bottles of wine, shopping bags from every luxury brand imaginable. They were burning through the money with a frantic, almost desperate glee. Each post, each story, each tagged photo was a gift. I saved everything. I used forensic software to download the images and videos with all the metadata intact, GPS coordinates, timestamps, device information. Her Instagram feed was becoming my Exhibit A. She wasn't just a thief, she was a proud, boastful one. She was documenting her own crime spree with a level of detail that a prosecutor could only dream of. There was one photo in particular that stood out. It was a selfie of her and Tiago in a lavish hotel suite. She was wearing a new diamond necklace, and he had his arm around her, a smug, possessive look on his face. The caption read, "Finally living the life I deserve with the man who knows my worth." The irony was so thick I could taste it. She was celebrating her worth by spending the last of her own inheritance with a man who was, by all legal definitions, her accomplice in a felony. He hadn't given her this life. He had simply helped her steal it from herself. It was during this period that I truly understood the woman I had married. I saw that her love wasn't a feeling, it was a transaction. She had seen me as an investment, one that had matured and was ready to be cashed out. Her charm, her beauty, her affection, it was all currency she used to get what she wanted. And when she thought she could get a better deal elsewhere, she liquidated her assets without a second thought. The realization was liberating. It cauterized the wound of my heartbreak, leaving a clean, hard scar. I was no longer dealing with the ghost of a lost love. I was dealing with a business problem, an opponent in a strategic game. As the date of her return approached, the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The divorce papers were ready, citing infidelity and financial malfeasance.
The criminal complaint was prepared, complete with my comprehensive forensic report, ready to be filed with the Federal Police's Cybercrime Division. Afonso had already taken steps to freeze the destination account, though we knew much of the money was already gone, spent on depreciating assets and fleeting experiences. The goal was not to recover the money, but to establish the criminal trail. We also discovered through a private investigator Afonso had hired that Tiago was not just a charming artist. He had a history of attaching himself to wealthy women, a string of broken relationships and accusations of financial opportunism. He was a parasite, and Isabella was his latest host. The trap was now complete. The legal, financial, and digital walls were closing in on her. She was flying home from her fantasy, tanned and confident, completely oblivious to the fact that she was not returning to a life of freedom and wealth, but to a reckoning of her own creation. The day she was due to land, I prepared the house. I removed any trace of my 2-week project, restoring my office to its normal state. I made the house look lived in, but with an air of melancholy. I wanted her to walk in and see the man she thought she had broken, the sad, lonely husband she had left behind. I bought a bottle of her favorite wine and left it on the counter, a final, subtle touch of psychological warfare. I wanted her to feel completely in control, to savor her perceived victory, just before I pulled the rug out from under her. I sat in the living room, the quiet hum of the air conditioner the only sound, and I waited. I was perfectly calm. The complex program I had written was about to execute its final command. There was no more emotion, no more anger, no more pain. There was only the quiet certainty of the outcome. The door was about to open, and when it did, the real Isabella would finally meet the real Juan. And only one of us would walk away. I was not just a coder or a jilted husband anymore. I had become an architect of consequence, and the foundations of the world Isabella had tried to build for herself were about to turn to dust. She had seen me as a simple binary man. She was about to learn just how complex my system truly was. The sound of the key in the lock was louder than I expected in the silent house. I didn't get up. I just sat there on the sofa, staring at the front door, my heart a steady rhythmic drum. She entered like a conquering hero returning from a successful campaign. She was glowing, her skin sun-kissed, her hair lighter. She wore expensive new clothes that hung on her frame with an easy confidence, and she was carrying a designer handbag that probably cost more than my first car. She dropped her keys into the ceramic bowl by the door with a clatter that announced her arrival, her ownership of the space. She saw me sitting there, and a slow, pitying smile spread across her lips. It was the smile of a predator that had successfully brought down its prey and was now returning to the carcass.
She sauntered over, not a hint of remorse or apprehension in her posture. She was radiating triumph. She thought she was walking into the third act of her own movie, where she would deliver a final, cutting monologue to her defeated ex-husband before waltzing off into the sunset with her lover and her fortune. She had no idea she was walking onto the set of my movie, and she was the villain who was about to get her comeuppance. She stopped in the middle of the room, striking a pose, holding the new handbag up slightly as if to showcase it. "Well," she began, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that made my skin crawl, "I see you've been holding down the fort." I said nothing. I just watched her, letting the silence hang in the air, a stark contrast to the cacophony of lies and betrayal that had filled our home for months. My silence seemed to unnerve her slightly, but she quickly recovered, her arrogance winning out. She thought I was broken, speechless with grief. "You know," she continued, walking over to the bar and pouring herself a glass of the wine I had left out, "I had the most incredible time. It was clarifying." She took a sip, her eyes closing in theatrical bliss. "It turns out, being away from all this stress was just what I needed." She gestured vaguely around the beautiful home I had provided for her, as if it were a prison. And then she delivered the line she had clearly been rehearsing for the entire flight home.
She looked me directly in the eye, her smile turning into a cruel, mocking sneer. I should thank you, really. Or I should thank your phone. Thanks to your little bank app, I was able to take a trip of a lifetime. I spent your money so lavishly. You wouldn't believe the things I bought. That was it. The confession. The final data point I needed, delivered voluntarily, arrogantly, to my face. And in that moment, all the tension, all the anger, all the meticulously controlled planning of the past few weeks coalesced into a single, overwhelming emotion. Amusement. I started to laugh. It wasn't a bitter, pained laugh. It was a genuine, deep, rolling laugh that came from my gut. It was the laugh of a man who has just heard the punchline to the cruelest, most elaborate joke in the world. The look on her face was priceless. The smugness evaporated, replaced by a flicker of confusion, which then morphed into irritation. This was not the reaction she had anticipated. She expected tears or yelling or begging. Laughter was not in her script. "What's so funny?" she snapped, her voice losing its silky edge. I finally stood up, wiping a tear of mirth from my eye. "Oh, Isabella," I said, my voice steady and calm. "You have no idea." I walked over to the coffee table and picked up a large manila envelope that had been sitting there. "You think you're so clever, don't you? You, the artist, the free spirit, outsmarting the boring tech guy. You think you hacked my phone, stole my money, and got away with it." I tossed the envelope onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud. "You didn't hack anything. You installed a cheap piece of spyware that I allowed onto my network."